Imagine standing somewhere on the British coast thousands of years ago, long before England existed, long before Scotland had a name, long before castles, cities, roads, kings, or borders divided this island from the rest of Europe. The wind is cold, the landscape is wild, and somewhere in the distance a small group of humans is moving through the ancient countryside, hunting animals, collecting food, watching the changing seasons, and trying to survive. They have no idea that thousands of years later, scientists will find pieces of their bones, recover fragments of their DNA, and use those fragments to answer a question that historians have argued about for generations. Who were Britain's first people, and where did they really come from? For a long time, the answer seemed impossible to know. Archaeologists could discover tools, pottery, graves, weapons, houses, and monuments, but objects could tell scientists what people did without always telling them who those people were. Then ancient DNA changed everything. Scientists began comparing genomes from prehistoric Britain with ancient genomes recovered across Europe, and suddenly the map of human history became much more complicated. The people who lived in Britain thousands of years ago were not isolated from Europe. They were part of enormous waves of migration that had been moving across the continent for thousands of years. And the deeper researchers went into the DNA, the more surprising the story became. Because Britain's population was not created by one migration, one tribe, or one mysterious ancient nation. It was built layer by layer through repeated movements of people across Europe. And one of the first major clues takes us back more than 10,000 years to the period after the last ice age. At that time, Britain looked completely different. Sea levels were lower, and the land that is now underwater beneath the North Sea connected Britain with continental Europe. What we now call the English Channel was not the same barrier it is today. A vast landscape known as Doggerland stretched between Britain and the continent, creating forests, wetlands, rivers, and open plains where animals and humans could move. There was no British identity. There was no French identity. There were only human communities following animals, water, climate, and opportunity. As the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, hunter-gatherer populations moved across Europe. Some traveled north as the glaciers retreated. Others followed rivers and coastlines. Eventually, some reached the far western edge of Europe and entered what would become Britain. These people are known to scientists as Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and their DNA gives us our first major answer. They were not genetically unique to Britain. They belong to a broader population often described as Western European hunter-gatherers. Their genetic relatives lived across large parts of Western Europe. This is where the famous Cheddar Man enters the story. Cheddar Man lived roughly 10,000 years ago and was discovered in Gough's Cave in Somerset. When scientists recovered and analyzed his DNA, they found that he belonged to this ancient Western European hunter-gatherer population. His existence destroyed one of the simplest ideas people once had about ancient Britain. He was not the isolated ancestor of a mysterious British race. He was part of a much larger European population that had been moving and changing for thousands of years. And this distinction is critical because ancient DNA does not work like a simple family tree where every ancient skeleton has a direct modern descendant. Instead, it reveals relationships between populations. Cheddar Man tells us that people living in prehistoric Britain were connected to hunter-gatherers elsewhere in Western Europe. In other words, the first chapter of Britain's genetic story was already European, but then something happened that would transform Britain forever, around 6,000 years ago. Farming began arriving in Britain. At first, archaeologists wondered whether the existing hunter-gatherers simply adopted the new lifestyle. Perhaps they learned how to grow crops. Perhaps they began keeping animals. Perhaps new technology spread from Europe while the same people remained in Britain. But ancient DNA told a different story. The arrival of farming was accompanied by the arrival of new people, and their ancestry was surprisingly different from the hunter-gatherers who had lived in Britain for thousands of years. These Neolithic farmers were connected to farming populations that had expanded across Europe from much farther east. Their deeper ancestry ultimately traced back toward Anatolia and the Aegean region, while some populations moving through Western Europe developed strong Iberian-related genetic signatures. By the time farming reached Britain, the people carrying this new way of life were genetically distinct from Britain's earlier hunter-gatherers. And then came one of the biggest population changes ever detected in prehistoric Britain. The genetic contribution of the earlier hunter-gatherers declined dramatically. This does not mean that every hunter-gatherer was killed or that an entire population suddenly disappeared overnight. Ancient DNA cannot tell us that. Population replacement can happen through many mechanisms: migration, disease, changes in birth rates, competition for resources, intermarriage, or a combination of different processes. But the genetic signal is powerful. The people living in Britain after the arrival of farming were substantially different from the people living there before it. And this is where the title of our story becomes especially interesting. If scientists compare these ancient British populations with populations across Europe, there is no single modern country that perfectly matches them. Why? Because modern European nations did not exist in the same form thousands of years ago. The borders we see on today's map are extremely recent compared with the age of these populations. 10,000 years ago, nobody was genetically British in the modern national sense. Nobody was genetically French in the modern national sense. There were populations, communities, and migration networks. Some groups moved hundreds or thousands of kilometers over many generations. Others stayed in the same region for long periods. So when scientists say that an ancient British individual is genetically closest to another ancient population from a certain region, they are not saying that modern people from that country are the direct descendants of that individual. They are identifying shared ancestry and population relationships. And once we understand that, the genetic map becomes far more fascinating. The earliest post-Ice Age people of Britain were connected to Western European hunter-gatherers. The first farmers had ancestry connected to continental European farming populations, with deeper origins in the Aegean and Anatolia, and with important western routes through Iberia. Then, thousands of years later, another enormous migration would change Britain again. Around 4,500 years ago, people associated with the Bell Beaker phenomenon began spreading into Western Europe. They carried distinctive pottery, new cultural practices, metalworking traditions, and, most importantly for our story, new ancestry. Ancient DNA revealed that the populations associated with the Bell Beaker expansion into Britain carried substantial ancestry related to populations connected to the Eurasian steppe. This discovery shocked researchers because the genetic change in Britain was not small. A major study published in Nature found evidence that the arrival of these populations was associated with the replacement of approximately 90% of the existing gene pool within a few hundred years. Think about what that means. A few centuries is almost nothing compared with human history. Yet within that relatively short period, the genetic composition of Britain changed dramatically. The monuments remained, the landscape remained. Rivers continued flowing through the same valleys. The stones of ancient monuments continued standing where people had placed them, but the population itself was undergoing a massive transformation. This is one of the most important lessons ancient DNA has taught us. Cultural continuity does not necessarily mean genetic continuity. A monument can survive while populations change. A tradition can survive while new people arrive. A technology can spread with migrants. And sometimes, a migration that barely appears in written history can leave one of the strongest genetic signatures scientists can detect thousands of years later. The Bell Beaker transformation was one of those moments, but the story still wasn't finished. As Britain moved into the Bronze Age, another important connection to continental Europe appeared. Researchers analyzing ancient genomes discovered evidence for substantial migration into southern Britain during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Between roughly 1000 and 875 BC, the ancestry of people in southern Britain changed significantly, and the incoming population showed strong genetic similarities to ancient populations associated with France. This is another major piece of the puzzle. Britain was repeatedly receiving people from the continent. The English Channel was not an impenetrable wall. It was a route. A dangerous route, certainly, but a route nonetheless. Boats could carry people, animals, goods, technologies, languages, and genes across the water. And over generations, those movements changed Britain's population. This Bronze Age migration is particularly interesting because researchers have suggested that it may have played a role in the spread of early Celtic languages into Britain. That does not mean DNA and language are identical. They are not. People can change languages without changing their ancestry. And populations can preserve ancestry while adopting completely different cultures. But when genetic evidence, archaeology, and linguistic evidence begin pointing toward related periods of major movement, the combined picture becomes much more compelling. Britain was not a sealed genetic island. It was a destination repeatedly connected to the European mainland. And then came Rome. By the time Roman forces invaded Britain in AD 43, the island already had thousands of years of migration behind it. Rome introduced another enormous network. Soldiers came, traders came, administrators came, enslaved people were moved. Merchants traveled between distant provinces. Britain became part of one of the largest political and economic systems the ancient world had ever seen. But here is another important lesson. Historical importance does not always equal genetic replacement. The Roman conquest was politically enormous, but that does not mean Romans replaced the majority of Britain's population. An empire can control territory without completely replacing its inhabitants. And this is exactly why ancient DNA is so valuable. It allows scientists to distinguish between political conquest and demographic transformation. Sometimes a dramatic historical event leaves a smaller genetic footprint than expected. Sometimes, a migration barely mentioned in surviving written records leaves a massive one. And after Rome, another major transformation began. Groups from continental northern Europe increasingly settled in parts of Britain. Later, historians would call many of these groups Anglo-Saxons, although the actual population history was more complicated than that label suggests. For centuries, scholars debated how large this migration really was. Was it simply a small warrior elite? Was it a limited number of settlers who gained political control? Or did large numbers of people actually move into Britain? Ancient DNA again changed the conversation. Researchers studying early medieval genomes found a substantial increase in continental northern European ancestry in England. Some individuals from eastern England carried very high levels of ancestry related to populations around the North Sea, including areas associated with modern Denmark and Germany. But there was an important detail. The pattern was not identical everywhere. Different regions experienced different levels of migration and genetic mixture. This tells us something incredibly important about Britain. Even after thousands of years of migration, Britain never became genetically uniform. Geography mattered, rivers mattered, mountains mattered, coastlines mattered, marriage networks mattered. Communities that lived relatively close to one another could still maintain different ancestry patterns over generations. And that brings us back to the idea of mapping Britain's DNA region by region. When modern researchers examine genetic variation across Britain, they can detect surprisingly fine-scale geographic structure. People from different parts of the United Kingdom can show subtle genetic differences that reflect long histories of local ancestry and limited movement between communities. These differences are not evidence of separate races. They are evidence of population history. A few centuries of people mostly marrying within nearby communities can leave a detectable genetic signal. Multiply that process over thousands of years, and the map becomes incredibly detailed. Now imagine putting all of Britain's ancient migrations on one timeline. First came post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers related to Western European hunter-gatherers. Then came Neolithic farmers whose ancestry was ultimately connected to earlier farming populations from the Aegean, and Anatolia, and whose Western European descendants included Iberian-related groups. Then came the Bell Beaker associated migration with substantial steppe-related ancestry, and a massive transformation of Britain's gene pool. Then came further Bronze Age movements, including a major connection with populations related to ancient France. Then came Rome and its vast imperial network. Then came early medieval migrations from northern continental Europe. Later came Vikings, Normans, and countless smaller movements. And eventually came the modern population. What you are looking at is not one ancestry line. It is a stack of migrations, a genetic archive built layer upon layer. This is why the idea that scientists found one European nation that perfectly matched Britain's first people is too simple. The actual discovery is more powerful. Different populations matched Britain at different moments because Britain's population itself kept changing. The earliest hunter-gatherers had their closest relationships within the Western European hunter-gatherer world. The Neolithic farmers connected Britain to continental farming populations. The Bell Beaker period connected Britain to populations carrying steppe-related ancestry. Bronze Age, southern Britain developed strong connections with ancient populations related to France. Later, medieval England received substantial northern European ancestry. The answer is not one country. The answer is migration. And this is where the story becomes personal. Because if you live in Britain today, your DNA is not simply the DNA of one ancient population. You carry a mixture of histories. Some ancestry may ultimately trace back to ancient hunter-gatherers. Some may come from Neolithic farmers. Some may descend from Bronze Age populations connected to the steppe. Some may reflect later movements from continental Europe. Some may reflect medieval migration. And the exact combination depends heavily on where your ancestors lived. This also explains why two people who both describe themselves as British can have noticeably different genetic histories. One person's ancestors may have remained concentrated in a particular region for generations. Another person's ancestors may have moved repeatedly between Britain and continental Europe. One family may have deep ancestry in eastern England, while another has roots in Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, or northern England. The national label can be the same, while the genetic history underneath it is different. And there is another misconception we need to destroy. Ancient DNA does not prove that one modern group is more British than another. There is no scientific purity test for British ancestry. There is no single ancient genome that defines what a British person is supposed to look like genetically. The population changed too many times for that idea to make sense. In fact, Britain's history demonstrates why genetic purity is such a poor way to understand human populations. Populations mixed with earlier populations, Iron Age communities changed, Roman Britain changed, medieval Britain changed, modern Britain continues to change. Human history is movement. DNA simply gives us a way to see some of that movement after the written record has disappeared. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is what happened to the earliest Britons. If their genetic contribution declined so dramatically, where did they go? Did they disappear completely? Probably not. Genetic replacement rarely means that every individual from an earlier population simply vanishes. Some may have died. Some may have moved. Some may have joined incoming communities. Some may have had fewer surviving descendants. Some of their ancestry may have survived in later populations, but at lower levels. This is why ancient DNA must be interpreted carefully. It can reveal population changes, but it cannot always tell us exactly what happened to every human being involved. Behind every genetic percentage were real people. Families, children, parents, communities. People who lived through climate changes, migrations, disease, competition, and cultural transformation. They did not know they were part of a demographic revolution. They were simply trying to survive. And yet their DNA survived long enough for scientists thousands of years later to reconstruct fragments of their story. That is what makes ancient DNA so powerful. A bone fragment can contain information that no historian could ever write down. A single genome can reveal that a person whose culture looked local actually had ancestors from hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. A cemetery can reveal that a community once considered isolated was connected to a huge migration network. And a population that disappeared from written history can suddenly return to the scientific record through DNA. This is exactly what happened with prehistoric Britain. The genetic evidence forced researchers to rethink the idea of continuity. Britain was not one population slowly evolving in isolation. It was repeatedly transformed by people arriving from outside. And this happened long before England, Scotland, Wales, or Britain existed as political identities. So when scientists compare Britain's first people with populations across Europe, the real mystery is not simply which region matched. The real mystery is how many times Britain changed. Think about the journey. A hunter-gatherer population arrives after the Ice Age. Thousands of years later, farmers cross into Britain. Their descendants build monumental landscapes. Then another migration arrives, carrying ancestry connected to the steppe. The genetic composition of Britain changes on an enormous scale. Centuries later, people connected to continental populations arrive again. Rome connects Britain to a massive imperial network. After Rome, northern European migrants reshape parts of England. Later, Vikings arrive from Scandinavia. Normans cross from northern France. And over the centuries, Britain becomes a country whose population contains layers from across Europe and beyond. The modern map hides this history because political borders make everything look permanent. But DNA reveals that borders are temporary. Populations are not. They move, they mix, they split, they disappear, they return in new forms. And Britain may be one of the clearest examples of this process in Europe. It is an island today, but genetically it has never been completely isolated. Its position at the edge of Europe actually made it a fascinating destination. Every time people crossed the water, they brought more than objects. They brought ancestry. They brought languages. They brought technologies. They brought diseases. They brought traditions. They brought children who would eventually become ancestors of people living thousands of years later. And that is why the DNA story of Britain's first people is so much more powerful than a simple claim about one matching region. The real revelation is that Britain was repeatedly rewritten by migration. The genetic record is a timeline written inside human bodies. And if we could watch that timeline unfold, we would see Britain changing again and again. First, the hunter-gatherers of post-Ice Age Europe, then the farmers who arrived from continental Europe, then the populations associated with Bell Beaker culture and steppe-related ancestry, then Bronze Age, migrants with strong connections to ancient populations related to France, then Roman-era movement, then Northern European migrations during the early medieval period, and finally, the enormous mixture that created modern Britain. The people of Britain today are therefore not the descendants of one mysterious ancient tribe. They are the descendants of many populations that met on an island at the western edge of Europe. Some arrived peacefully. Some may have arrived during periods of conflict. Some came as families. Others may have come as warriors, traders, farmers, or migrants. Some stayed for generations. Others disappeared into larger populations. But all of them left traces. And the most surprising lesson is that the people we call the first Britons were themselves migrants. They did not appear magically on the island. Their ancestors had moved through Europe before reaching Britain. In that sense, the story begins long before Britain. It begins with human movement across an entire continent. So perhaps the biggest discovery isn't that Britain's first people matched one particular region. It is that the idea of a single original British population doesn't survive contact with the DNA. Britain's history is a story of arrivals, a story of replacement and mixture, a story of people crossing landscapes and seas, a story of populations disappearing while pieces of their ancestry survive. And when scientists compare the ancient genomes of Britain with the rest of Europe, they are not simply looking for one answer. They are reconstructing a moving map of humanity, a map where today's borders disappear, a map where France, Spain, Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, and the Mediterranean are no longer isolated boxes, but pieces of a much older network. And perhaps that is the most astonishing conclusion of all. The DNA of Britain does not tell the story of a people who stayed exactly where they were. It tells the story of people who kept moving, people who crossed rivers, people who crossed mountains, people who crossed the sea, people who met strangers and became ancestors. And thousands of years later, their DNA still carries evidence of those encounters. So the next time someone says that Britain's first people came from one place, remember what the ancient genomes are actually telling us. The answer is not a simple country. It is not a single race. It is not one bloodline. It is a chain of migrations, stretching across Europe and through time. And Britain's DNA is the record of that journey, a journey that began after the Ice Age, crossed the continent, reached the edge of the Atlantic, and continued changing for thousands of years. The people changed, the cultures changed, the languages changed, the borders changed. But one thing remained constant. Humans kept moving. And that is the hidden story written inside Britain's DNA.